What made you stop trusting professionals with your child? Last Wednesday, I got the call that my son Elijah was choking at his autism therapy center. By the time I arrived, they were already loading him into the ambulance with a tube down his throat. The therapist, Miss Lexi, explained that Elijah choked on his snack during break time, but I hadn't packed any snacks for him. During the ride, things got even worse. My boy's throat was clear, but he was still somehow blue and purple in the face. His brain was shutting down from a lack of oxygen, and the medics kept telling me this shouldn't be happening. At the hospital, he was rushed to the back immediately. The doctors came back 4 hours later, telling me my kid was on life support. I went to instinctively hug him for support, but he stepped back in disgust. His face had an expression almost like he was accusing me, and he asked if I needed to confess anything. It took me an hour of pleading to convince him I had no idea what he was on about. That's when he pulled out an x-ray of my kid's lungs. There it was. Gray industrial foam, the kind used for soundproofing, embedded deep in Elijah's lung tissue. The craziest part was when the doctor pulled it out, some of this foam looked weeks old. Something had been happening at the therapy center. That night, I got a call from my insurance company. They said they were sorry to hear about my son, but the plan I had with them meant they could only cover 72 hours of life support. The only way I could extend this coverage would be to prove that foul play was at hand and that I hadn't deliberately done this for an insurance payout. I tried to argue over the phone, but got nowhere. The next morning, I went straight to Miss Lexi's classroom. Why was there foam in my son's lungs? I asked bluntly. Her face went pale and she backed against the wall, her hands shaking. Sometimes their sensory toys break, she started stammering. This was soundproofing foam, not sensory toy foam, I responded. She stuttered something about talking to the director and excused herself for a meeting. There were other parents in the classroom dropping their kids off, and I saw fear in some of their eyes too. In the parking lot, one of the parents, Jennifer, stopped me. Is Elijah okay? My son Billy told me something yesterday. She looked around nervously. Billy says Miss Lexi brings foam blocks in her bag and takes some kids to the back room, but only the kids who stim go with her. My face went white. My son rocks and hums constantly. It's how he self-soothes. Billy says he hears crying from that room. The crying stops, but the kids don't come out for another 20 minutes. I felt sick. Another parent, Robert, overheard and joined us. My son Max came home gagging last week. Miss Lexi said he ate too fast at snack time, but Max said he never got snacks. He's been refusing to go to therapy. He won't tell me why, he just screams. I stormed back into the therapy center immediately and demanded to see the security footage from the quiet room. The director, Mrs. Wilson, folded her hands on her desk. I'm afraid that camera has been broken for months. How convenient. The room where Miss Lexi puts our kids through who knows what, the camera is broken. Mrs. Wilson shot up like she was offended. Miss Lexi is our most experienced therapist. You're overreacting to an unfortunate accident. Accident? There's old foam in my son's lungs, I yelled. She stood up. Without proof, your son just ate some foam. His kind aren't the brightest anyway. I suggest you take a look at your own parenting and maybe you'll find a pattern. Now leave before I call security. I flipped her off on my way out. 30 minutes later, I was in my car making the 90-minute drive to the state licensing board. When I got there, the woman at the desk barely looked at me. She told me to file a complaint online and I'd get a response in 6 to 8 weeks. I told her I had 3 days until they took my son off life support, and she told me to take it up with law enforcement. So I did. I made the 90-minute drive back, but Mrs. Wilson had gotten to the station before me. I saw her walking out and flashing me a grin. When I complained to the officer, he redirected me to the lady Mrs. Wilson spoke to. We know what you're doing here. I kindly suggest you leave before we put you in handcuffs for professional harassment and child endangerment. My jaw dropped. As I walked back to my car, I realized if the law wasn't going to help save my son, then screw the law. I called my best friend Jacob, who was studying law, and told him I need a favor. I need you to scare the truth out of her. That same evening, Jacob and I arrived at Miss Lexi's house with Jacob wearing his best suit, carrying a briefcase, looking like a high-powered attorney. She went pale as soon as she opened the door. Miss Lexi, I represent the Garner family. We need to discuss your options before criminal charges are filed. We stepped into her house. Her words came out broken. Cry criminal charges? Watching her face drop more and more was priceless, but Jacob didn't even directly respond. Instead, he started speaking in legal jargon that she didn't understand. By the time he was done, she understood one thing. 25 years minimum. That final sentence was all it took. Her knees buckled and she started chugging water. Actually choked on it before managing to compose herself, which was great irony. But Jacob wasn't done. Your husband is an educator. He will lose his job. His life will be ruined. Your kids will grow up hating you, wondering why mommy tortured children. Miss Lexi was sobbing now, curled on the floor. Please, Jacob pulled out his phone. I call the DA, or you can tell me exactly what you've been doing to these children. Miss Lexi collapsed harder onto her living room carpet, her whole body shaking as she rocked back and forth in this weird way that reminded me of how my son rocks when he's stressed. Jacob held his phone up, still recording everything while she grabbed a tissue from the coffee table and blew her nose hard, mascara running down her face in black streaks. Her breathing came in these short gasps, and she kept opening her mouth to talk, but nothing came out for what felt like forever. They made us do it. She finally got out, her voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear her. Mrs. Wilson said our funding depends on reducing behaviors, and nothing else was working fast enough to meet the state requirements. Jacob moved closer with his phone while I stood frozen by the door, my hands clenched into fists. She started talking faster now, words spilling out as she described something called the quiet mouth protocol, which made my stomach turn. She explained how they would take small pieces of foam, industrial soundproofing foam from the storage room, and push them into the mouths of kids who hummed or made noise during sessions. The first few times the kids would spit them out right away, so they had to get creative with their approach. They started doing what she called calming holds, where they would restrain the child from behind, arms wrapped around them tight, and force the foam deeper into their throats while telling them to be quiet. I wanted to throw up listening to this, but I forced myself to stay still and let Jacob handle the questions because we needed every detail on that recording. She admitted they'd been doing this for 8 months, starting with the kids who stimmed the most, the ones who rocked and hummed constantly like my Elijah. The protocol had specific targets based on which behaviors the state reviewers would notice most during their quarterly visits. Miss Lexi's hands shook bad as she reached for her phone on the side table, scrolling through her messages with her thumb while tears dripped onto the screen. She turned it toward us, and there they were, text after text from Mrs. Wilson with timestamps going back months. Make them quiet by any means necessary was sent at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I don't care how just get results before the review appeared 3 days before the state inspection. The board is watching our behavior reduction rates, and do whatever it takes filled the screen as she scrolled down. Jacob grabbed his own phone and started taking pictures of her screen, making sure to get clear shots of every message with the timestamps and phone number visible. I stood there fighting every instinct to grab this woman and shake her while she kept saying sorry over and over, that she never meant for anyone to get really hurt, that she thought the foam would just dissolve or come out naturally. She said she didn't know it would get stuck in their lungs, that Mrs. Wilson told her it was safe, that other centers were doing similar things to manage difficult behaviors. Jacob got everything. The recording, the photos, her admission that 12 other kids had been through the protocol, names she rattled off that I recognized from the center. We left her house and I practically ran to my car, driving straight to the hospital while Jacob followed in his car to make backup copies of everything. The ICU was quiet when I got there at 4:30 a.m., just the steady beeping of machines and the soft voices of night shift nurses checking on patients. Elijah's machines showed stable numbers, but seeing him lying there with tubes everywhere made the rage burn hotter in my chest. I sat next to his bed for 30 minutes, holding his small hand and telling him Daddy got the proof that we were going to make this right. At exactly 5 a.m., I walked to the nurse's station and asked for Megan Bennett, the hospital social worker who'd just started her morning shift according to the schedule posted on the wall. She came out carrying a coffee mug with cats on it, looking tired until I showed her my phone with the recording. Her whole face changed as she listened to the first minute, setting down her mug so fast coffee sloshed onto the counter. She grabbed my arm and pulled me into a small conference room, closing the door behind us before pulling out a yellow legal pad. "Play it again from the beginning," she said, and I did while she took notes, her pen moving fast across the paper. When we got to the part about the quiet mouth protocol, she stopped writing and stared at me with her mouth open. After the recording finished, she immediately picked up the desk phone and started dialing numbers she knew by heart. She called the State Child Protection Hotline first, giving them her hospital ID number and explaining she had a mandated reporter situation involving multiple victims. Then she called the Attorney General's office emergency line, bypassing our local police completely since they'd already shown they wouldn't help. She explained to each person that this went beyond one child, that we had evidence of systematic abuse at a therapy center targeting disabled children. Between calls, she told me she was documenting everything properly for the insurance company, that with official reports filed, they couldn't deny coverage. She made 6 phone calls in 20 minutes, each time giving case numbers and reference codes while I sat there watching this woman work like a machine. The last call she made was to someone in the hospital administration, telling them they needed to get risk management involved immediately. 15 minutes later, 3 people in suits showed up, introducing themselves as the hospital's risk management team. Megan showed them the foam samples the doctors had removed from Elijah's lungs, which were stored in sealed evidence bags in the hospital lab. Their faces went pale when they realized what this meant for the hospital if they didn't handle it right. How many other kids might have been treated here with similar symptoms that got missed or misdiagnosed? One of them pulled out a laptop and started typing notes, while another one asked for copies of everything we had. I handed over the recording on my phone, and they made me email it to their legal department right there. The third person kept making calls to their lawyers asking about liability and mandatory reporting requirements. After an hour of this, I left them to their panic and found a quiet corner to call the insurance company. The automated system kept me on hold for 15 minutes before I finally got through to someone who transferred me 3 more times. Finally, a woman named Gabriella Singer picked up, and I explained about the recording and the confession we got from Miss Lexi. She typed loudly on her keyboard while I talked, then put me on hold for another 20 minutes without warning. When she came back, her voice was flat and professional. "We need official documentation from authorities, not just a recording." I wanted to throw my phone at the wall, but instead I asked Megan for help finding a specialist. She pulled up a list on her computer and started calling pulmonologists while I sat there watching the clock tick down on my son's coverage. Dr. Arthur Hess's office was the 4th one she called, and his secretary heard the word emergency and actually listened. She shuffled appointments around and squeezed us in for that afternoon. I spent the rest of the morning in the hospital cafeteria calling every parent I could remember from the therapy center. Most didn't answer, but 7 families called me back within hours with stories that made me sick. One mom said her daughter stopped talking after sessions with Miss Lexi. Another dad mentioned his son had been coughing up weird stuff for weeks, but they thought it was allergies. I wrote everything down in a notebook Megan gave me, filling page after page with dates and symptoms and suspicious incidents. Jennifer showed up at the hospital around noon carrying a manila folder thick with papers. She spread them out on the cafeteria table, showing me calendars where she'd marked every time Billy mentioned the quiet room. Her son had drawn pictures too, crayon drawings of kids with blocks in their mouths that she'd thought were just weird kid imagination. The dates matched up with days Elijah had come home upset but couldn't tell me why. Robert's wife arrived an hour later with a stack of medical records from their pediatrician. She showed me photos on her phone of Max's throat from last month, red and raw with scratches the doctor had blamed on acid reflux. Their insurance had paid for an endoscopy that found irritation, but no obvious cause. Now we knew better. She started crying looking at the photos, and I put my hand on her shoulder while she pulled herself together. Dr. Hess's office was in a medical building 20 minutes from the hospital. His waiting room had fake plants and old magazines, but he came out personally to get us instead of sending a nurse. He was tall and thin with gray hair and glasses that kept sliding down his nose. In his exam room, he spread out all the x-rays and CT scans from Elijah's file, then added the photos and records from Max. He used a magnifying glass to look at the foam samples in their evidence bags, turning them over and studying the texture. He dictated notes into a recorder about particle size and tissue damage patterns, while I sat there trying to understand the medical terms. After 2 hours of examination, he sat down at his computer and started typing fast. His report was 6 pages long and stated clearly that the foam patterns were absolutely not consistent with accidental ingestion or any kind of self-harm behavior. He printed 3 copies and signed each one with his medical license number clearly visible. Back at the hospital, Megan had commandeered a conference room and covered the table with folders and papers. We spent the next 3 hours organizing everything into a formal packet for the Attorney General's office. She had a system with colored tabs and numbered sections that would make it easy for them to follow. We made 5 complete copies, keeping the originals locked in the hospital's safe. She even had me sign a chain of custody form showing who had access to the evidence. That evening, I was home trying to eat dinner when my doorbell rang. A process server handed me an envelope and left without saying anything. Inside was a cease and desist letter from Mrs. Wilson's lawyer threatening to sue me for defamation and harassment. The letter used big legal words, but basically said I had to stop talking about the center or face a lawsuit. I called Jacob and read it to him over the phone. He came over with his laptop and helped me write a response that didn't back down, but also didn't give them ammunition. We sent it to the lawyer's email and kept a copy for our records. The next morning at 7, someone knocked hard on my door. 2 people in polo shirts with CPS badges stood on my porch with clipboards. They said they got a report about child endangerment and needed to do a wellness check. Megan had warned me this might happen as retaliation, so I was ready. I let them in and showed them around while staying calm even though my hands were shaking. They looked in my fridge and checked the smoke detectors and asked about Elijah's medical care. The woman investigator took notes while the man mostly just looked uncomfortable. After 40 minutes of questions and checking every room, they found nothing wrong because there was nothing to find. The woman investigator pulled me aside while her partner went to their car. "Between you and me, we've gotten complaints about that therapy center before that got buried." She handed me her card and told me to call if I needed anything for my case. My phone rang at 6:30 that morning, and it was Gabriella from the insurance company saying they reviewed the evidence packet Megan sent over and could give us a 24-hour extension while their special investigations unit looked at everything. Not much time, but better than nothing. I thanked her and immediately called Dr. Hess, who agreed to squeeze Elijah in for a detailed bronchoscopy that afternoon. When we got to the hospital, Dr. Hess took me to a viewing room where I could watch the procedure on a monitor. He inserted the scope down Elijah's throat and started taking high-resolution images of everything he found. The screen showed older foam deposits embedded in the lung tissue that had clearly been there for weeks based on how the tissue had grown around them. Dr. Hess pointed at dark spots on the monitor and explained these weren't from the recent incident, but from repeated exposure over time. He documented everything with timestamps and measurements, creating a medical file that proved this was ongoing abuse, not a single accident. While I was still at the hospital, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was Ivy Rollins, a journalist who wrote for a disability rights magazine, saying Jennifer had given her my number and she'd been investigating the therapy center for months after getting tips from other parents, but never had concrete proof until now. I met her in the hospital cafeteria, where she showed me a folder full of complaints she'd collected from families across 3 counties, all describing similar incidents with kids who stemmed being taken to back rooms and coming home with unexplained injuries or behavioral changes. I gave her copies of everything except the recording of Miss Lexi's confession, since Jacob said we should save that for official authorities only. Ivy promised to dig into the center's financial records and procurement history to see what else they'd been hiding. That evening, the Attorney General's office finally called back, and the woman on the phone said they were assigning investigator Gideon Armstrong to the case, and he wanted to meet with me first thing in the morning. She gave me his direct number and said he'd already started pulling records from the state licensing board. Around 9 p.m., my phone rang with a number I recognized as Miss Lexi's. She was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her at first, begging me not to press charges and saying she'd tell me everything about the training Mrs. Wilson made them do if I'd just leave her out of the criminal case. I grabbed my phone's voice recorder app and started recording without telling her, letting her ramble about how sorry she was and how she never wanted to hurt anyone. She mentioned 2 other therapists, Sarah and Aaron, who were also using the foam protocol and said they'd all attended a workshop 6 months ago about behavior suppression techniques that Mrs. Wilson paid for them to attend. Miss Lexi kept talking about how the workshop leader demonstrated putting foam in a mannequin's mouth to show how it would muffle sounds, and Mrs. Wilson took notes the whole time, then bought the supplies the next week. I kept recording as she described how they practiced on stuffed animals first before moving to the kids, starting with small pieces and working up to larger chunks when the children learned to spit them out. She was crying harder now, saying she knew it was wrong, but Mrs. Wilson threatened to fire anyone who didn't meet the new, quiet compliance standards, and she couldn't afford to lose her job with 3 kids at home. The call lasted 47 minutes, and I got all of it recorded. The next morning, Gideon Armstrong showed up at my house at 8 a.m. sharp, wearing a suit and carrying a thick briefcase. We sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours going through every piece of evidence, while he took detailed notes and asked specific questions about dates and times. He reviewed the recording of Miss Lexi's confession, the medical reports from Dr. Hess, the photos of text messages, and all the parent statements Megan had helped me collect. Gideon made copies of everything on a portable scanner he brought and had me sign forms establishing chain of custody for each piece of evidence. Before he left, he made several phone calls from my driveway, and I heard him issuing preservation orders for all the center's computers, phones, and paper records, telling whoever was on the other end that nothing could be destroyed or removed from the premises. Later that afternoon, I got a call from the hospital saying the ethics committee was holding an emergency meeting about Elijah's case. They wanted me there to answer questions, so I drove over and found myself in a conference room with 12 doctors and administrators all looking at Dr. Hess's reports. The committee chair, an older woman with gray hair, said they were classifying this as a sentinel event, which meant it triggered a mandatory system-wide investigation and policy review for all their contracts with therapy providers. They asked me detailed questions about the timeline and took notes on everything while someone typed up an official report on a laptop. Meanwhile, Ivy had been busy with her investigation and called me that evening with huge news. She'd found purchase orders through a public records request showing the center bought industrial soundproofing foam in bulk 3 different times over the past 8 months. All signed by Mrs. Wilson herself with budget codes indicating it came from their therapeutic supplies fund. The supplier, a company called Sound Block Industries, had even included a warning on the invoice stating the product wasn't safe for oral contact and should be kept away from children, but Mrs. Wilson signed off on it anyway. Ivy emailed me copies of everything she found, including an email from the supplier to Mrs. Wilson, specifically stating the foam contained chemicals that could cause respiratory damage if ingested. That same night, I started calling every parent I could find from the Autism Support Group Facebook page, and within 2 hours, my phone was ringing non-stop with families sharing their own stories. Jennifer organized a meeting at her house the next morning where 12 families showed up, some driving over an hour to get there, and every single one had a kid who'd gotten worse at the center in the past 8 months. One mom brought medical records showing her daughter had throat injuries the doctor couldn't explain. Another dad had videos of his son gagging and choking at home after therapy sessions, and 3 families had kids who'd stopped talking completely after being verbal before starting at the center. We made a spreadsheet with dates and symptoms, and patterns started jumping out immediately, like how all the affected kids were the ones who stimmed the most, and how the problem started right after the center bought that first batch of foam. I called Gabriella at the insurance company first thing Monday morning and told her about the 12 families and Gideon's investigation, and she put me on hold for almost 40 minutes before coming back to say they'd approved another week of coverage since there was now an official case number from the AG's office. The insurance company's special investigations unit was getting involved too, because this was looking like massive fraud on top of everything else, and Gabriella said they'd be sending their own investigators to review all the medical claims from families at the center. That afternoon, Mrs. Wilson posted on the center's Facebook page, calling us hysterical parents looking for attention and blaming our kids' problems on bad parenting and vaccines and everything except what her staff had been doing. The comments section went crazy within minutes, with parents posting photos of medical records and x-rays and demanding answers, and someone even posted screenshots of Mrs. Wilson's deleted posts from months ago, where she'd bragged about their new behavior reduction success rates. Jacob came over that evening with his laptop and helped me put together a formal complaint for the state licensing board with all our evidence organized into sections with tabs and everything, including Ivy's purchase orders and the supplier warnings and statements from all 12 families. He uploaded everything to their portal and also mailed physical copies by certified mail because he said government agencies sometimes lose digital files when they don't want to deal with something, but they can't ignore certified mail without legal problems. 3 days later, I was at the hospital with Elijah when Jennifer called to say state investigators were at the center with a search warrant and parents were being turned away at the door. She was parked across the street taking photos as investigators carried out boxes of files and computers and even pulled foam blocks from a locked supply closet that Mrs. Wilson had claimed didn't exist. The investigators also found a binder labeled Quiet Mouth Protocol with detailed instructions on how to use foam to stop vocal stimming, complete with diagrams showing proper insertion angles and hold positions to prevent spitting out. Jennifer sent me photos of everything as investigators loaded it into evidence vans, and I forwarded them straight to Gabriella and Gideon and anyone else who might help keep my son alive. That same afternoon, Gideon called to say Miss Lexi's lawyer had reached out offering full cooperation in exchange for immunity from prosecution, saying she had emails and text messages proving Mrs. Wilson forced the therapists to use the foam protocol or lose their jobs. Gideon said he couldn't make deals without the prosecutor's approval, but he was very interested in what Miss Lexi had to share, especially since 2 other therapists had already quit the center and might be willing to testify too. The next morning, the center's board of directors held an emergency meeting that lasted 6 hours before voting to suspend all operations immediately, sending out an email blast to parents saying services were discontinued effective immediately due to ongoing investigations. Parents were scrambling to find new therapy providers, but most places had waiting lists months long, and the special needs community Facebook groups were full of families begging for recommendations and sharing which centers had openings. Jennifer started a Google Doc where parents could list available services and warnings about other centers that might be doing similar things, because now everyone was paranoid about what might be happening to their kids during therapy. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Dr. Hess scheduled Elijah for another procedure to remove more foam he'd found deeper in the airways during a new scan. The procedure took 3 hours with Dr. Hess carefully extracting foam pieces that had been pushed so far down they'd formed pockets of infection, and when he came out, he showed me a jar with gray foam chunks covered in pus and blood. Elijah's oxygen levels went up slightly after the procedure, but he was still on life support because his body was too weak to breathe on its own, though Dr. Hess said removing the infected tissue might help his lungs start healing faster. 2 days after that, I was in Elijah's room when Gideon called to say they'd arrested Mrs. Wilson that morning on charges of endangering children and tampering with evidence. She'd tried to delete emails and destroy documents even after the preservation order, which added obstruction charges to everything else, and the judge set bail at $50,000 with conditions including staying away from any facility serving minors. Mrs. Wilson posted bail that same day, using her house as collateral. But the news was already spreading through parent networks, and her photo was shared everywhere with warnings to keep her away from kids. Gabriella called that afternoon with the best news I'd gotten since this nightmare started, saying the insurance company approved continued coverage indefinitely while criminal proceedings were active since this was now documented as assault rather than a medical condition. They were also preparing a massive lawsuit against the center's insurance company to recover costs, and Gabriella said they'd probably be going after Mrs. Wilson personally too, since she'd acted outside her professional capacity by ordering staff to harm children. 2 weeks crawled by with me basically living in that ICU room, and I was talking to Elijah about everything and nothing when I felt it. His fingers squeezing mine just barely, but it was there. The nurse rushed over when I yelled and confirmed his reflexes were coming back, though she kept saying stuff about not getting too hopeful yet, which I ignored completely. That same afternoon, Gideon called saying Miss Lexi took a plea deal for lesser charges if she'd testify, and she'd already handed over emails where Mrs. Wilson literally wrote things like, meet behavior reduction quotas or find another job, which made me want to throw my phone. The lawyer handling her case sent copies to our attorney who said this was exactly what we needed for the lawsuit, especially the part where Wilson threatened to fire anyone who didn't get results fast enough. Meanwhile, Ivy's articles were blowing up online, and the state announced they were reviewing every single autism center in the region after she found similar complaints at 3 other places nobody had connected before. The review board sent inspectors everywhere, and parents were posting photos of them showing up unannounced at centers, clipboards out, asking kids questions, which should have been happening all along. 4 days after that first squeeze, the doctors moved Elijah to a regular room with all these monitors, but at least he was breathing without the ventilator, even though he still couldn't talk or swallow anything. I spent hours just watching him breathe on his own, counting each breath like it was a miracle, which I guess it was considering what those monsters did to him. The feeding tube looked awful, but the nurses taught me how to use it and clean around it while Elijah just watched me with these big eyes that broke my heart every time. Our lawyer filed the class action that week with 23 families signed on, going after both the center and their insurance company for not investigating previous complaints that parents had apparently been filing for months. The insurance company tried to get dismissed from the suit, but the judge shut that down fast when our lawyer showed they'd gotten multiple reports about kids getting hurt at that specific center. 3 months after this whole nightmare started, Mrs. Wilson's trial began, and I sat in that courtroom watching Miss Lexi take the stand in her cheap gray suit, looking like she hadn't slept in weeks. She told the jury everything about their training sessions, where they were taught that stimming was basically defiance, and they had to stop it no matter what to help the kids be normal, which made several parents in the gallery start crying. The prosecutor had her read from the training manual they'd found during the raid, actual printed instructions about using physical intervention to stop disruptive behaviors, with foam specifically mentioned as an option. Another therapist testified the next day about how she'd quit 6 months ago after refusing to participate, but Wilson had threatened to blacklist her from working anywhere in the state if she reported anything. She'd kept recordings of Wilson screaming at staff meetings about quotas and threatening to fire anyone whose kids were still stimming after a month of treatment, playing them right there in court. The jury took 4 hours to find Wilson guilty on everything, and the judge gave her 5 years, plus she can never work with kids or disabled people again, which still didn't feel like enough, but at least it was something. 2 weeks after the verdict, I finally brought Elijah home with his feeding tube and this whole schedule of therapies and medications that took up half our kitchen counter. He was so delayed from everything that happened, but he was alive and home, and that's all that mattered, even though I had to quit my job to take care of him full-time. The center's building went up for sale immediately to pay all the lawsuit settlements, and this group of autism parents bought it to start a non-profit with cameras in every room and parents allowed to observe any session they wanted. They painted over everything and put up this big sign about acceptance and neurodiversity, and Jennifer from the parking lot that first day ended up running the whole thing with actual autistic adults helping design the programs. 6 months went by, and Miss Lexi got out of jail early for good behavior, and the letter she sent me sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I could even open it. The envelope had this shaky handwriting, and when I finally read it, she wrote about how sorry she was, and how she never meant for things to go so far. But sorry doesn't bring back the months of hell we went through. I threw the letter in a drawer and focused on dealing with the insurance company who finally agreed to cover most of Elijah's care after their lawyers decided it was assault, not a medical issue. But we still had bills coming in every week that ate up our savings. The speech therapist alone cost $200 a session, and Elijah needed 3 sessions a week plus occupational therapy and feeding therapy and special equipment for his room. Ivy called me one afternoon to tell me she won some big journalism award for her articles about the center, and her investigation got 3 more places shut down in other states when parents there read her stuff and started asking questions. She sent me a copy of the award with a note saying none of it would have happened without us speaking up first, which was nice but didn't help pay the bills or make Elijah better. Gideon got promoted to head of some new task force for investigating abuse and disability services, and he called to thank me for bringing the case to him because it changed his whole career path. He said they were already looking into 20 other facilities and finding problems at half of them, which made me sick thinking about all those other kids going through what Elijah did. The state legislature passed something they called Elijah's Law, requiring cameras in every therapy room and surprise inspections, and parents getting footage within a day if they ask for it. The governor signed it at this big ceremony and invited us, but Elijah was having a bad day with his feeding tube, so we watched it on TV instead, while the nurse adjusted his medications. Jacob graduated from law school that spring and told me he was going to specialize in disability rights because our case showed him where he could actually help people instead of just making money doing corporate stuff. He set up his practice in the same building where the old therapy center used to be, which felt like some kind of justice, even though nothing could undo what happened. Almost a year after everything started, I was helping Elijah with his morning routine when he looked right at me and said, "Dad," clear as anything, and I just stood there frozen because the doctor said he might never talk again. His special education teacher had been working with him every day using picture cards and sign language, but hearing his voice again made me cry right there in his classroom. The aide they assigned him actually understood autism and didn't try to stop him from rocking or humming because she said that's how he processes the world, and there's nothing wrong with that. Our parent group became an official nonprofit organization with Jennifer as president, and we started reviewing therapy centers and putting together warning signs for other families to watch for. We made this whole checklist of red flags like broken cameras and staff who won't let parents observe, and kids coming home with unexplained injuries or behavior changes. Robert's family moved to another state for a fresh start, but he still helps run our online support group and shares resources about trauma therapy for kids who went through similar stuff. Dr. Hess published this big medical paper about how to tell the difference between kids accidentally eating foam and someone forcing it down their throats, and now emergency rooms have to learn about it in their training. He sent me a copy with all the medical terms, but basically it came down to the pattern of the injuries and how deep the foam went and how old some of it was, which proved what we'd been saying all along. Megan got recognized by the state social work board for how she handled everything, and now she travels around training other social workers about spotting institutional abuse. She told me she uses Elijah's case in every presentation to show how one person speaking up can save other kids, even when the system tries to shut them down. The old therapy center building sold for way less than it was worth because nobody wanted to be associated with what happened there, but at least the money went to the families who sued. Some parents got enough to cover their kids' therapy, but most of us just got a few $1,000s which disappeared into medical bills pretty fast. Mrs. Wilson tried to appeal her sentence, but the appeals court said 5 years wasn't even enough for what she did and denied her request, so at least she's still locked up where she can't hurt any more kids. Miss Lexi lost her therapy license forever, and last I heard she was working at a grocery store, which seems about right for someone who tortured children for a living. 2 years crawled by with Elijah getting stronger each week, but never quite the same kid he was before the foam. His speech therapist worked with him every Tuesday and Thursday, while his occupational therapist came Mondays and Wednesdays, and slowly he started eating soft foods again and making sounds that almost sounded like words. The feeding tube came out after 6 months, and he could swallow mashed potatoes and applesauce without choking, which made me cry the first time I watched him do it. His weight came back up to normal, and the dark circles under his eyes faded, and he started smiling again when I'd tickle his feet, or play his favorite cartoon songs. Mrs. Wilson tried to appeal her 5-year sentence, but the appeals court shut her down hard after 3 former employees showed up at her parole hearing to testify about how she'd threatened to fire anyone who didn't meet her behavior reduction goals. One therapist brought emails where Wilson called the kids defective products and said they needed to be fixed by any means necessary, which made the parole board deny her request in less than 5 minutes. The old therapy center building sat empty for almost a year before a group of parents bought it cheap and turned it into a community resource center with free support groups every evening and respite care on weekends. We'd meet there Tuesday nights and joke darkly about how something good finally happened in those rooms where our kids used to get hurt. The story went viral after Ivy's article got picked up by national news outlets, and suddenly I was getting calls from parents in Texas and California and New York asking how to spot the warning signs. Oregon passed their own version of Elijah's law requiring cameras in all therapy rooms, and then Washington did the same, and then 12 more states followed, and now there's a federal bill being written that would make it nationwide. Jennifer brought Billy over for playdates, and at first the boys just sat near each other, not really playing, but after a few months, Billy started showing Elijah how to stack blocks, and Elijah would hum while Billy talked about trains. They understood each other in this quiet way that other kids didn't get, and Billy never once tried to stop Elijah from rocking or flapping his hands when he got excited. Robert sent me pictures from their new house in Colorado where Max was working with a therapist who actually celebrated when he stimmed because she said it meant he felt safe enough to be himself. Max had started using an AAC device to communicate and told his parents he loved them for the first time in 2 years, which Robert said made his wife sob for an hour straight. The spring concert at Elijah's new school came around, and they gave him the triangle to play in the band, which seemed perfect since he could rock and hum while he played it. I sat in the 3rd row watching him up there in his little bow tie swaying back and forth while the other kids played their recorders and xylophones, and nobody tried to make him sit still or be quiet. His aide stood nearby but didn't touch him or redirect him because this school understood that stimming wasn't something to fix, but just part of who he was. The music teacher even smiled when Elijah started humming along with the melody because she said it showed he was really feeling the music. After the concert, we went for ice cream, and Elijah ate his chocolate cone so carefully like he was afraid it might hurt him, but then he smiled with chocolate all over his face. That night, I tucked him into his dinosaur sheets and pulled his weighted blanket up to his chin the way he liked it. He grabbed my hand when I turned to leave and pulled me back down to his level and wrapped his skinny arms around my neck. "Love you, Dad," he said, clear as day like he'd been practicing it for weeks. My throat got tight, and I hugged him back gentle so I wouldn't scare him, and told him I loved him too more than all the stars in the sky. We've both got scars from what happened at that center with him carrying the physical ones in his lungs that still make him cough sometimes, and me carrying the guilt that I didn't see it sooner. But we're here, and we're fighting, and we made it through, and that's what matters most. Every night when I check on him before I go to bed, I watch his chest rise and fall without any tubes or machines, and remember when I thought I'd never get to bring him home again. The other parents from our support group are all at different stages of healing, with some kids doing great and others still struggling, but we all know we're not alone anymore. The laws we fought for won't bring back the months or years our kids lost, but maybe they'll stop this from happening to other families, and that has to count for something. Thanks for riding along with me through all those twists and turns. Definitely felt like a whole journey just wondering about things together. Can't wait to do it again next time. Like the video, it helps more than you think.